Everyone, thanks so much for joining. It's a pleasure to have you here today. We'll be looking at locating and applying for governmental and private grant funding in today's webinar. All the mics are muted, and we'll be opening them up at the end for a 30-minute question and answer session. Let's get started. Okay, now the topics that we'll be covering today are as follows. First of all, we'll take a look at locating grants. We're going to take a look at some of the resources that are out there to facilitate locating grants. There's a lot of different ways people go about it. There are a lot of different resources people use to find grant opportunities. We'll be taking a look at some of the more popular resources. Next, we'll take a look at applying for grants. Once we've located the opportunity, how do we go about applying for it? What does it take to secure that grant, to secure the funding for our agency? We'll take a look at the grant application. We'll take a look at some specific information that may be required, whether it's on the grant application or what the funders may typically require, and then we'll take a look at some of the general tips. Let's first focus on locating grants. So there are three types of funders out there. When it comes to nonprofit funding, when it comes to nonprofits securing finances for their agency, there are three categorical funders out there. There are professional associations, such as, let's just take for example United Way. There are mission-specific associations, for example, National Cancer Society. These would be classic examples of professional associations. These associations many times provide funding for the association members. Whether this funding will be sufficient to operate the agency alone, whether this funding alone would be sufficient to operate the agency, or whether the association might provide subsidiaries. Regardless, professional associations, many of them typically offer financial support to their members. Next, we have foundations. Foundations come in three, let's just say, versions. Okay, there are three versions of foundations. There's the private foundations. These are typically foundations sponsored by either activists with a cause or family foundations. These would be private foundations. Then there are corporate foundations. For example, Microsoft has their nonprofit arm that funds a variety of different projects. IBM has a nonprofit arm. Most conglomerates have some sort of nonprofit arm. Most big companies will typically have a nonprofit arm. Whether they have that nonprofit arm for tax purposes, whether they have that nonprofit arm for PR purposes, or whether they have that nonprofit arm simply because they believe in what they do and they feel that just because some people can't participate, or just because, for example, say Microsoft is trying to reach a certain demographic, it's trying to target a certain demographic. Let's say they're trying to target students. Now, they'd like to capture the student market share when it comes to desktop computers. Now, being that they've done some research on the student market and they realize that students will never be able to pay the price of their desktop computers, they go ahead and launch a nonprofit arm that sponsors computers for students who don't have the financial means to purchase one. So they're trying. So we'll just for our purposes, let's assume that Microsoft is trying to capture the student market simply because they believe it's crucial for students to be exposed to Microsoft's latest technology. They feel it's crucial for them to succeed, but they know they'll never be able to capture that market with a for-profit strategy. They go ahead and they implement a nonprofit strategy. The bottom line is that there are a lot of reasons why corporations may have nonprofit arms. There are a lot of reasons why corporations may fund or may maintain their own foundations. But nevertheless, regardless of what the motive is, corporate foundations are another version of foundations that are out there. And finally, there are community foundations. These are foundations that support local community activism, local community social services, local community general nonprofit missions. These would be the typical versions of foundations. Next, there are federal funders. Federal funders fund let's, for example, the United States government. The United States funds literally hundreds of thousands of different types of nonprofit missions, whether it's housing, whether it's housing, whether it's food, whether it's a local, whether it's foreign. There are hundreds of thousands of types of federal funds that are out there. These are the three types of funders that comprise roughly about 98% of the nonprofit, let's just say, grants market. Now let's take a look at professional associations in a bit more detail. Professional associations typically will fund smaller amounts. Their grants in general are smaller in size. Typically, in order to be eligible for funding from the professional association, the nonprofit agency applying for funding would have to be a member of that association. What's involved in membership varies across different associations, but typically a nonprofit agency applying for funding from a professional association would have to be a member. Sources to help locate funds that are available from associations would be the association websites, would be notices in the association's journals, would be the association's Office of Research, or if the association has a governmental component, then sources of the grant opportunities would be found through the Office of Governmental Affairs. This would be a classic snapshot of the funding available by associations. Foundations. Foundations don't really have any particular size of funds, any particular criteria. Every foundation is different. The level of the size of the grants are different. The causes that they fund are different. Every foundation maintains their own criteria. Now, in order to locate funding that's available, foundation funding that's available, you would search by subject. For example, environmental, say a nonprofit group primarily concerned with environmental degeneration would search for foundation funding based on that specific mission. The nonprofit can search on the Foundation Center. They can search for COS funding opportunities. They can search through SPIN. And they can search through GrantsNet. These are all very valuable resources that provide funding opportunities based on specific topics, based on specific interests, based on specific missions. In addition, there are print directories and then general web browsing. Once the funding opportunity has been located, in order to zero in and find out more information about what that opportunity requires, what that opportunity entails, best would be to review the Foundation's website, the foundation that sponsors, the foundation that's sponsoring that grant. Another very valuable resource would be to read annual reports and IRS 990 filings from that particular foundation to see what they've actually funded, what levels, what size their grant is. And then probably the best and most practical way is just to talk to the program officer. Talk to the administrator, to talk to someone that's administering that grant within the actual foundation. This would sum up foundation funding. Now let's take a look at government funding. So government funding, again, like we've said, there are extensive opportunities, virtually no limit to what the government funds. There's virtually no limit to the amount of causes, the amount of missions federal funders might fund, whether that's national, whether that's international, whether they're economic driven, whether they're purely nonprofit driven. There are extensive opportunities out there, and it's pretty difficult to review all the opportunities at once. In addition, federal funders are constantly adding and revising programs. This may be due to local politics. For example, a state senator or a local state senator is working on his reelection campaign, and he sees that the majority of his constituents are very interested in seeing funds going to a specific cause. He may go push for legislation to get federal funds going to that cause. At the same time, there may be a political opponent and his constituents don't want those funds going there, and he may go appeal that legislation.